Dames en heren, geachte leden van de Corona bijzonder warm welkom hier in Maastricht deze namiddag. A warm welcome to everybody who would not be able to understand Dutch. As an international university, we normally proceed in English and the lecture will be given in English. But I prefer to do this introductory word just in Dutch, because this is the language of our region, of course. Hartelijk welkom vanmiddag. Professor Bos, van harte welkom. Speciaal uiteraard ook aan u. En een speciaal welkom ook aan uw promotor, vroegere promotor, professor Dr. Clemens Kool. Het heeft de rector magnificus, of de rectrix magnifica, professor Dr. Rianne Letchert behaagd, hier aan deze Universiteit Maastricht voor Urbi et Orbi bekend te maken dat professor Dr. Jaap Bos, dus Dr. Jaap Bos, benoemd is in de School of Business and Economics tot hoogleraar Banking and Finance. Deel van deze traditie is dat de nieuw benoemde hoogleraar een publieke les geeft, een lecture geeft, een inaugurele rede of een inaugurele les geeft. Ik geef zo meteen de spreker het woord, maar ik wil u alvast verwittigen dat deze lecture een van de ramblings of an economist zal zijn. Jaap heeft een bijzonder mooie website, u zou die eens moeten bezoeken, waar hij het regelmatig heeft over de ramblings of an economist. En als we zeggen rambling, dan betekent dat wandelen, zeer geïnteresseerd rondkijken, door heel veel zaken tegelijkertijd geprikkeld worden. En Jaap's research interests, they speak the whole book. Jaap is geïnteresseerd in competition, concurrentie, performance, risk-taking, business cycle, geography, location, failure, also in economic growth, efficiency, productivity, convergence, sustainability, technology spillovers and innovation. Ik hoop dat heel veel van deze onderzoeksgebieden, heel veel van deze concepten ook gematerialiseerd worden, Jaap, in jouw inaugurele rede. Ik houd er voorlopig mee op. Het is mij bijzonder genoegen om als decaan van de faculteit onze rector te mogen vervangen. Het is de rector normaal die de oratie, de inaugurele rede voorzit. Jaap, the floor is yours. Met heel veel belangstelling zullen wij allemaal naar u luisteren.
Dear Dean, dear Corona, dear family, dear friends, dear former teachers, and of course, dear colleagues, welcome. I'm very happy that you are all here, and it's a pleasure for me to tell you in the next 45 minutes a little bit about what it's like to be a professor of banking and finance in Maastricht. So, I'm going to start in October of last year, when I found myself in Yorkshire. And I had just bought a pen and some paper, and I was putting pen to paper, because after endless teasing of my colleague Rachel Pownell about her oratie, she made it understood that once she had hers, the tables would be turned on me. So I realized I needed to do something. So I put pen to paper. I was sitting in front of my tent overlooking Robin Hood's Bay, and nothing came out. And then I started thinking, why is this? And I realized it's because even though I am a professor of banking and finance nowadays, I feel a little bit of a cheat if I hold a lecture which is purely about banking and finance. Because as our dean already said, I think my research is about a bit more than that, and it felt a little bit like cheating. So I came back from the trip, not having produced an oratie, and I mentioned this to my good friend and co-author Mark Sanders, who is also in the audience. And he said to me, "Oh, I figured you would just start with a Springsteen quote and talk about efficiency." So there we go. And the quote I'm going to show you is from a song called Badlands, and it's about what we all want. And what it says is that poor men want to be king, or to be rich, sorry. Rich men want to be king, and a king ain't satisfied until he rules everything. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is about efficiency. And what I'm going to tell you is a tale of efficiency and its discontents, or in Dutch, slightly different translation, een fabel over efficiëntie en haar ongenoegen. What I want to do is, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, tell you a little bit about my research agenda in the past, present, and future. But first, I want to actually change your perspective a little bit. And I would like all of you, for some of you this is a little bit difficult, to have a look at that window up there, with the lady who is upside down. De dame die op haar kop staat. Why? Because last carnival holiday, I stood in this very room, just after carnival, together with a wise man. He's in the audience, sitting in the first row next to the dean. And he said, you know, if the world is in fact upside down, this lady is the only one who has the right perspective. Which I think are very wise words and also a bit of a humbling thought. Als de wereld eigenlijk op zijn kop staat, dan ziet zij het goed. So that's the perspective I'm going to choose in this talk, the perspective of this wise man and his two travel companions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let them travel in a straight line, but still come full circle. I'm going to let them talk about things that they do not have knowledge of yet, and I'm going to let them witness things that they've never seen. In other words, I'm going to tell a story, which is what we often do as scientists. Another wise man who is also in the audience told me last week, you know, when I have my own PhD students, I will tell them when they start that they only should worry about two things at first: knowing how to tell a story and being able to collaborate. Well, the first one I've already talked about. The second one is basically the moral of my story today. So, before I introduce actually our tour guides, let me clarify a few things, so we're all on the same page. This is the formal part of this lecture, right? This is when you come to school. Probably a lot of you feel like this today. So, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about efficiency, about productivity, and about technical change. So let me explain each one of them for you. So let's start with the easy one, productivity. Imagine that you are 167 centimeters tall, and you're competing with me. Now, my passport says that I'm 189 centimeters tall. I'm getting older, so maybe I'm a little bit less tall nowadays, but let's say 189. And you and I both do a long jump, and we jump 4 meters, 400 centimeters. Now, our productivity is our output, how far we jump, divided by our input, let's say our height. So 400 divided by 167 means that your productivity is 2.4. My productivity is less, because I also jump 400 centimeters, but my height is 189 centimeters, so my productivity is about 2.12. So you're more productive than I am. So that's the easy one. Then move on, and let's talk about efficiency. Now, you are still 167 centimeters, and you jump 400 centimeters, but you have a friend who's an avid long jumper. She's really good at it. As a matter of fact, she's the best. And she jumps 500 centimeters. That means she's more productive. Actually, 500 divided by 167 means that her productivity is about 3. But more interestingly, because she's the best, it means that you jump about 80% of what the best jumps. 400 divided by 500. So actual output divided by optimal output, and we have efficiency. Then the third one, technical change. So let's say that tomorrow, your friend, who's still 167 centimeters, actually jumps 520 centimeters instead of 500. So she actually jumps 4% further than she did before. That's technical change. So now that we're on the same page, and we have a bit of an idea of what I mean when I talk about efficiency, let's move on. And I guess it's time to actually start introducing our tour guides, because they're getting a little bit restless. So let's see. So we find ourselves at the banks of a familiar river, and here are our 3 tour guides. So in light of the topic of efficiency measurement, I'm going to use an abbreviation for them, and I'm going to use the abbreviation based on efficiency distributions. So we have half normal at the top, truncated normal after that, and a semi-definite distribution after that. So we have H, T, and S. Not coincidentally also the first letters of their first names. So here we see them standing by a river. And they are actually thinking of crossing, so it's not a coincidence that I was talking of a long jump, because they're thinking of actually jumping across. Interesting thought, but fortunately, they move a little bit further. And it's a good thing that they did, because once they move a little bit further, they encounter a bridge. And it's a familiar bridge for quite a few of you. Actually, for some of you, it's a bridge that you cross every day. So they stand by that bridge, and they realize they don't have to actually jump across the river. Nevertheless, the idea of jumping has entered their mind, and they decide to have a bit of fun. So they decide to have a competition. Now, I should tell you that the top two, H and T, they're about the same height. S is a little bit smaller. So they jump, and they tally up their results. And they make a graph, they're very smart, and they make a graph to actually show their results. And this is what it looks like. So on the horizontal axis here, we have their height. I told you, H and T have the same height. And S is a little bit less tall. S also jumps less far than the other two. But H and T being the same height, H jumps further than T. So H is more productive than T. What I've also shown here is actually for how far all of the people of their height, how far the best people jump. The frontier, the benchmark, the best. And what we see is that none of them are 100% efficient. They're not on the benchmark. They're not like that long jumper that jumps 5 meters. But two of them are quite close. On the top right, it's H. On the bottom left, it's S. T is a bit further away from the frontier. Or so it seems, because as we'll see, the real story is never that easy. So they've done their long jump, and they decide to move on. So the first thing they do is actually they're going to cross that bridge. And as you know, on the other side of that bridge, some of you may have been there not too long ago, is the train station. That's great, because if you get on that train station and you take a train and then another train and then another train and then another train, you actually make it to the far south of France. And you end up in the beautiful city of Toulouse. And where you find yourself is in my favorite bar in Toulouse, Le Bar Basque. Now, I often say to my PhD students that some of my best ideas were conceived in bars. I also tell them that most of my worst ideas were also conceived in bars. Our three guides are sitting there. They're taking a little bit of rest and some refreshments. But what two of them don't know is that the third one has been secretly practicing. And he's been doing squats. He's been actually trying to jump further. So what they decide to do is have another go at it. And they jump again. And again, they tally up their results in the same way that we saw before. I hope. There we go. So, we have the same setting as we had before. And as a matter of fact, we can see immediately who was the one who was secretly practicing. It's little s. H and T have the same efficiency and the same productivity as before, but S is now on the frontier. It's a day later, and look how much he has improved. So how awesome that is. He's very happy with himself, also getting a little bit tired, but he's the first one who actually manages to be 100% efficient. So with one happy tour guide and two not so happy tour guides, they decide to move on. So what they do, once you're in Toulouse, Airbus, they get on a plane, they travel the ocean, and they travel actually to the deep south. And where they're going to go is to a little college town called College Station, where they find themselves around a smoker barbecue, enjoying some good barbecue. So they're sitting there, and T, who's on the top here, he's quite the engineer. And he thinks about the last time that they jumped, and S being on the frontier. And he's not completely satisfied. He thinks that something's off. So he tries to convince the other two that actually they've made the wrong comparison. And he draws it out for them. And the drawing looks actually like this. So here's what T argues. Yes, S is on the frontier, but S is on yesterday's frontier. And he jumped today. So the catch is that between yesterday and today, the frontier has shifted. It's no longer the same. People have broken the record. And interestingly enough, as you can see, not so tall people actually jump even further, have broken the record even further than really tall people. So even though S is efficient, he's only efficient in yesterday's terms. And technical change has basically nullified his efficiency. So with S being a little bit glum about this, they decide to move on. But they're getting also a little bit tired. So they decide that it's maybe time to look for another means of transportation. So they decide to leave College Station. And of course, they agree that there's no better way to transport yourself than using one of the greatest human inventions. I guess you can see where this is heading, quite literally, the bike. And not coincidentally, it's one with orderly panners in the front and in the back. So you can travel the world, and Scotland in particular. The long jump conquest, however, is not finished. They're still a little bit puzzled. And again, it's T, now at the top right, top left, who notices something. And he makes an interesting point. So he's the least efficient one. But he wonders whether that is correct. Because he thinks actually that, contrary to the other two, he's actually practicing a different sport. So he shouldn't be compared to them. He has a different benchmark. And his point is as follows. Whereas the other two are doing a long jump probably the way most of you would, namely running and taking off and using your left or your right leg to jump, he's actually running and using both his legs to jump. So he says that he cannot be compared to the other two. He has a different benchmark. The other two look at him kind of confused, and not everybody agrees at this point. First, they decide to get on their bikes and move on, and where they go is, of course, a dream destination, quite literally. They head, you've guessed it, to Patagonia. Once they get to Patagonia, T takes pen and paper, and he decides to draw out this enigma that he's encountered. And what he draws is the following. So it turns out that he actually has a point. So here we see the original frontier, we see H and T, and we see S, now efficient on yesterday's frontier, so we ignore the technical change for a second. But what we also see is a second frontier, and that's the frontier for people who jump with both legs, who use both legs to propel themselves. And as it turns out, that is particularly difficult for people that are a little bit taller. So T actually has a point. Compared to this new frontier, he is much more efficient than compared to the old frontier. Of course, H and S disagree, and they say, yeah, but now you're comparing apples and oranges. How can we actually compare then? There's no way that we can actually compare your efficiency with mine. It's a problem. And actually, it's a problem that in an earlier paper I have defined as, or have called the benchmarking paradox. If we want to benchmark, if we want to compare each other, we have to assume, ironically enough, that we share a common benchmark. If we don't have a common benchmark, we can still benchmark, but the results actually are pretty meaningless. So they haven't quite solved it. They found the problem, but they haven't quite solved it. So you've guessed it, they move on. And it's time for them to finally move to the promised land, aka Scotland. So what they do is they get on their bikes and they make their way to the Highlands. And in particular, they make their way to a famous tower to get some perspective on things. Now, as they get there, S climbs to the top of the tower, and H and T are looking at him climbing at the top of the tower, and they start thinking again. This time they have something in common, because all three of them are getting a little bit annoyed, because their mom has dressed them up quite stylishly. They're looking very fancy, and that's all great, but it's not great if you're riding a bike or trying to do a long jump. So they find that their clothes are a little bit restrictive and not allowing them to jump as far as they otherwise could. They agree that H is wearing the most relaxed clothes, T is wearing the most restrictive clothes, and S is somewhere in between. So even though this does not change their efficiency per se, it does mean that the road to the frontier, the distance to the frontier, is a bit steeper, as you can see here, for some than for others. For T, it's the steepest, because he's got the most restrictive clothes. Without those clothes and wearing proper athletic clothes, he's much more likely to jump further. For H, at the top right, the clothes are the least restrictive, and for S, the bottom left, the clothes are somewhere in between. So again, they've changed a little bit their perspective, and it seems that the same distance to the frontier does not have the same implications for everyone. So meanwhile, they're approaching 5 o'clock. It's on a Friday, and they feel a little bit thirsty. They want a drink. Nothing alcoholic, but nevertheless. So where better to go if you're in Scotland than to a distillery? And if you want to go to a distillery, where better to go than to go to the beautiful magical island of Islay. So that is where they're heading. And if you've ever seen a distillery, you know that distilleries, certainly in Scotland, are actually known by their pagodas. And these are the pagodas of one of the most famous distilleries off the west coast of Scotland called Ardbeg. And there they find themselves in front of Ardbeg. It's a beautiful bay, clean air, beautiful views, and they're enjoying themselves. Maybe it's the scenery, but they feel a little bit inspired, and they come back to this old benchmarking paradox, comparing apples and oranges. And they come up with an idea that just might work. So what they decide is that, or what they agree upon is that, yes, there are different frontiers, but maybe we can benchmark the benchmark. Maybe we can actually create an envelope over those frontiers, or what is sometimes called a meta-frontier. And that way, even though we have apples and oranges, we can still compare them. Whether that always works is, of course, highly questionable, but it's certainly something that some people have tried. So by now, they've pretty much always been practicing their long jumps, and they've been practicing their long jumps secretly, just like Es was. As they move on, they decide to reach for the sky. Or more precisely, they decide to go to the Isle of Skye, still on the west coast of Scotland. Now, the Isle of Skye is a special place. One of the most beautiful places in the world, very scenic. And as they travel there, they find out it's also quite a difficult place to get to. And something happens on the way to Skye. And the thing that happens seems very small at first. What happens is that they're still practicing their long jumps. They're still not helping each other, but they're no longer practicing in isolation. They actually start practicing together. And they see how the others practice their long jumps. And they watch, and they learn. And knowledge spills over. And they start actually learning from the best practice of each other. And it's not that everything that the other does is immediately applicable to them, but there's little things here and there that they can use to actually improve their performance. They haven't really talked about it yet, but it's there. So before they actually do something with this knowledge, they do reach one point, namely that they decide that instead of just looking how far each one of them is jumping, it would be interesting to see how far they can jump together. So we return to a familiar picture, and this is what we find. So what we see is that the frontier, indicated by the dark bar, so 4 meters for H and T, is the same for H and T, and it's a little bit less far for S. What we also see is that the actual length of their jump, indicated by the lighter bars, shows that none of them are 100% efficient. None of them are on the frontier exactly. But jointly, out of the maximum of 10 meters that they could jump together, we see that they actually reach 7 meters. Not bad at all. Actual output over optimal output, 7 over 10, 70% efficient, 30% inefficient. So just looking at this and considering this makes them think, but they're not really doing anything with this knowledge just yet. So first, they decide that after their refreshments at Ardbeg, they're getting a little bit hungry, and maybe it's time to head home. But first, they need to drop off their bikes. So off they go. They travel back to where they found their bikes, and in the meantime, they keep on practicing further and further, jointly. And the process of practicing further and further on their trip to actually drop off their bikes, without them knowing it at this point, has an effect. And they will find it out after they dropped off their bikes, because after they dropped off their bikes, they decide to do a long jump again. And once they do, here's what happens. So here we see their original results. Remember, together they jumped 7 out of the maximum of 10 meters. But once the results of them learning from each other and watching each other kick in, actually each one of them actually jumps further than ever before. And together, they reach no less than 8.5 meters. So the distance to the frontier, which was 3 meters before, is now halved. It's only 1.5 meters. And their efficiency has increased from 70% to 85%. So, yes. So without them even being aware of it, actually just by learning from each other, they've improved their efficiency individually and jointly. So then they start thinking, yeah, but how much does this matter? Do we really, really care? And how much do people actually care about long jumps? Well, maybe you could say the same thing about banks or of high-tech industries. Now, they've gotten a day off from their principal today, and they decide that maybe they should ask for another day off next week on Wednesday, because there's a seminar that shows that if you apply the same principle to banks in the US in the last crisis, what you find is that those banks that actually do not learn even from their own mistakes have half the chance of surviving the crisis of those banks that do. And you can apply the same principle to electricity producers, to courts, and to many, many other areas. So, feeling like they've accomplished something, our friends decide to head home. But before they do so, remember, so far they've had a fun journey and a very safe journey. There's a problem, and it's a big one. They encounter a beast, and in some circles, this beast is known as valorization. What should they do? So they've come so far, they've taken us on this beautiful journey, only to fail so close to the end. So what we're going to do is we're going to lend them a hand and make them come home safe and escape, for now at least, from this beast of valorization. So off they go, and they head back to what is known in these circles as the mountain, and to you in your invitations as the Minderboedersberg. So they decide to ask for some help. And they get help from this guy who looks a bit like Santa Claus. And today, at least, that guy is me. So here we are together. And it's time to actually think about what we've learned from this little journey of these 3 tour guides. So since we are 1 week after, you guessed it, the 11th of the 11th, I thought I would tell you my 11 efficiency lessons. It is November. There we go. Let's start with the first one. Efficiency is a tool, not a means, and certainly not an end. The best example came at the beginning of our story. Remember that our friends actually started to practice the long jump because they thought they needed to use it to cross the river. But also remember that they never actually jumped across the river. They just used the bridge. Too often, we use efficiency as the ultimate goal, thinking that thereby we make the world better. And it's rarely ever the case. Related, the second lesson. Efficiency is about outputs and not about inputs. So I think you would all agree with me that few of us, or hopefully none of us, would suggest to little S that the best thing he can do is be 20 centimeters taller tomorrow. Not only is that not very feasible, but it's also questionable whether that would really make the world a better place. Micromanaging inputs and thinking that thereby you can actually increase output, there's very little evidence in practice and in research that shows that that is actually what you need to increase efficiency. Efficiency is about letting people decide for themselves how to maximize output and then finding out how those that are best at doing it do it. Lesson number 3. Maximizing efficiency can cost you dearly in technical change. Remember little S secretly practicing. He was efficient, but only compared to yesterday's frontier. If we ask of people to be efficient 100% all of the time, they have no time, they have no room to actually innovate. And if the world changes between today and tomorrow, they might be efficient in yesterday's terms, but not very efficient in terms of tomorrow. Lesson number 4. Measurement matters, but not all that matters can be measured. So a lot of what I presented to you was about studying how far our 3 tour guides jumped. But the interesting thing is that the moment that they really improved and went from 7 meters jointly to 8.5 meters was about a process that, if you listen carefully to how I described it, is very, very hard to measure. It was about them observing each other, about actually trying to find out what is the best practice, about trial and error. Lesson number 5, not for our young tour guides, but nevertheless. Explaining efficiency difference is often like talking about sex, not a very good idea to do in public. Explaining efficiency difference is very different from measuring efficiency. I'm not going to dwell on this further because that would be beyond the point. Optimizing the efficiency of individuals and forgetting about the team is often very foolish, especially in a situation where we ask of each and every one of us to be very good at very, very different things. We encounter a situation where it's very rare that everybody is good at everything. And if we indeed are supposed to function like a team, then we might reach very, very suboptimal efficiency if we only focus on the individual and forget about how we can actually help out each other. Lesson number 7. An important one. Remember this benchmarking paradox. Setting a common benchmark, whether it's an annual review or a report card or whatever it is, it does not necessarily improve efficiency in itself, it just redefines it. It means that we are holding T, who's practicing actually a different sport, accountable against a benchmark that is not a valid benchmark for him. So thinking that we can improve efficiency by actually using the same measuring stick for everybody is rarely a good idea. Remember what I said about trial and error, and about the process that happened to our young tour guides, especially once they got to this Isle of Skye. The optimal path to an efficient outcome is seldom straight. And as a result, a lot of the tools that we use as economists are very ill-equipped to actually handle this trial and error process that might really underline and pick up how we can become more efficient. Lesson number 9. Effective people are very efficient. Efficient people are not always effective. I mean 2 things with that. First of all, if we can agree that some people just get shit done, and our models indicate that they are not very efficient, then the first thought should be that the model is wrong. Now about the second part of that sentence. Efficient people are not always effective. Let me mention one reason. One way of becoming efficient is by doing the same thing over and over and over again. And if you don't want to be doing or need to be doing the same thing all the time, if the world is actually more dynamic, if the world changes, then this makes you very effective, very efficient, but again, in yesterday's terms, and not in a way that is actually really, really useful. Now, I told Wim that I had something about education as well, so there we have it. Rational inefficiency is slack worth its weight in gold. Example. Innovation in education. If we want to innovate in education, and we come up with all kinds of plans and we pour all kinds of money into it, but we require our teachers to be 100% efficient all of the time, then there is going to be no innovation in education because it's them who actually need to implement it. And without having a little bit of slack in the system, there's no way that you're going to get actually innovation. We can talk about it later. For now. Last, but certainly not least, sustainable outcomes are efficient in the end and do not need to be beforehand. Just like short-term profits, short-term efficiency is seldom the result of a sustainable and responsible business practice. So, my 11 efficiency lessons. I hope that the next time that you're being benchmarked, or your kid is being benchmarked, or you get your annual review, you should actually think about this. If you want a copy of this, I gladly share it with you. This also means, however, that we have sort of arrived. We've come full circle, and we found ourselves back at the mountain. So it's time for me to say a few words in closing. So. And I want to start by saying thanks, briefly. I hope to talk to each and every one of you later, and I'm extremely grateful that you're all here. It means a lot to me. I wish to thank a few people in more detail. So, in true progressive Dutch manner, I am the academic child of a same-sex couple. One of them is here, so I'm going to start with him. Dear Clemens, you are, in all that that implies, my academic father. And let me recount three distinct but related things. So the first one, at least initially, appears to not be about you, but it is. So I remember being in Groningen and actually sitting together with a PhD student of Michael Kutter, who had asked me to help him with a programming problem. And we were sitting behind his laptop, he opened his computer, and he apologized to me because all of his projects for his PhD had three-letter codes, and they had the same subfolder structure, and anybody who's ever worked with me knows that I very much was appreciative of that, but interestingly enough also was aware of where that came from. And it's that moment that I realized that I myself was an academic grandfather, because the reason why that PhD student did that was because Michael did, and the reason why Michael did it was because I did that. And it taught me something about the importance, not just in these relatively trivial things, but in much more in general, in pedigree, which is often also very hard to measure, but very, very important, and influences on a daily basis how we do research and how we teach. And my pedigree, to a very large extent, comes from you, and I'm very grateful for that. Second, economists like to think of endowments, incentives, and efficiency, and what we tend to think of less is intentions and craftsmanship. Craftsmanship is not sexy, and intentions are hard to measure, and increasingly what cannot be measured is not important. I think it actually is, because it changes how we view the world and also how others view us. And the longer I walk around, the more I realize how important that is. And again, I have to thank you for that. Third, and something that I only realized much later on, is how much freedom I got from you as a PhD student. What now is sort of common practice, at the time I think was more or less unheard of. Me applying for an NWO grant, going abroad, writing a paper with somebody else, doing all these things, you allowed me to take so much freedom, and me being here today is in large part also the result of that. So in short, thank you very much, I appreciate it. Then my second academic father. He's not here, but he might be watching online, actually. So I don't know. Jim, if you're watching, this is for you. So what do you call a guy, Jim Colari, by the way. So what do you call a guy who invites an unknown Dutch kid to come to his, visit him in College Station, teaches him how the banking world works, helps him get his first top-tier publication, and encourages him, pun intended, to look for frontiers in research? It's a bit of a hero, to me anyway. That's what you are. We have not worked together in a while, and I think it's about time that we do. The next person on my short list, or hit list, is also quite obvious. It's Piet Eichholz. There you go. Piet. So I'm going to offend you first. I just called Jim a hero, so the question then is, what do you call a guy who gives the keys to the car to somebody who actually should not be allowed to hold a driver's license? A fool? Dear Piet, you're welcome. Thank you so much for the trust, for the coaching, and for showing me that the Yvonne Chouinards of this world also exist within these walls. It's a pleasure to learn from you on a daily basis how to break the rules to make this little world of ours even better. And if we are indeed the cowboys of finance, then you are John Wayne. Being the department chair of this wonderful department you've created was never my ambition in life, but it is actually very wonderful, and I'm truly proud of each and every one in our department. So thanking you, our department father, is also a way of thanking everybody in the department. I'm almost at the end of my short list, and my next thank you is to my own academic kids, my PhD students. There are 12 of you the last time that I counted, and quite a few of you are in the audience today, for which I'm very, very grateful. I often joke that I'm your research assistant, and as with every joke, there's a bit of truth in that. I learn a lot from you, and when I say to friends and family that I have a very well-paid hobby, it's in a large extent thanks to you. So it's very special to me that you are here today. So, the most important thank you. Let me start with a quote, and in Dutch. Bedank je moeder maar voor haar steun tijdens je studiejaren. So these were the words that my dad spoke, or I messaged, last Friday after we'd both gotten home from attending a whiskey festival in The Hague. He was right, but I do want to say a little bit more than that. So let me change to Dutch for a moment to do that. Beste pa en ma, ik heb in deze zaal en ook in Gent wel eens eerder Springsteen gequote, om aan te geven dat we zelf vaak het resultaat zijn van paradoxen. En ik denk dat het feit dat ik hier sta zeker ook het resultaat is van één hele grote paradox. Wat krijg je als je enerzijds je zoon een omgeving biedt die vol is met boeken, waar iedere avond tijdens een goed maal aan tafel wordt gediscussieerd over de samenleving, politiek, religie en alles wat daarmee samenhangt. En als je anderzijds het geringe belang van een carrière onderstreept, geluk benadrukt, alsmede ook de goede dingen des levens. Het resultaat staat hier voor jullie en ik ben daar erg dankbaar voor. Let me, in thanking my parents, actually say something to my PhD students. When I talk to you about how to approach your PhD, I often say talk to your parents and explain to them what your research is about. If they do not understand it, it's your fault. If they do not find it interesting, it's your fault. If they do not offer suggestions, it's your fault. My parents are the reason why I can confidently say such things, as well as the reason why, in the bigger picture, these things actually do not matter much. It's a paradox I cherish and a nice way to end these thank yous. Dank jullie wel. So, let me finish in the same manner that I started, but with a little bit of a different tone. So I'm going to end, before I show you quite literally the bigger picture, with something called The Rising. Written after 9/11, not coincidentally. And it reads, "Come on up for the rising. Come on up, lay your hands in mine. Come on up for the rising. Come on up for the rising tonight." So it is collaboration in the end that matters. Ik heb gezegd.
Ja, dames en heren. Gaat u rustig zitten, professor Bos. U heeft dat wel verdiend. Gefeliciteerd, Jaap. Van harte. Gefeliciteerd om meerdere redenen. Uiteraard voor je hele mooie oratie, die ook het product is ongetwijfeld van een unieke samenwerking. Want ik heb net vernomen dat de achtergrond, het schilderij, dat ik bijzonder mooi vind, bijzonder leuk vind, door je vader gemaakt is. Klopt dat? De collaboratie met je petekinderen leidt tot een uniek, denk ik ook, pedagogisch instrument. Dank ook aan jullie voor jullie inzichten, jullie inspiratie, want jullie zijn inspiratoren geweest, heel duidelijk, voor professor Bos, voor onze Jaap. Dank, Jaap, oprecht voor de inzichten, de gedachtenspinsels, die bij mij in ieder geval, maar ik hoop bij heel velen van ons, nog wat inzinktijd nodig hebben. Er zit heel veel in. And everything you said can and will be used against you. En dat zullen we ook doen in de gesprekken die wij regelmatig hebben, maar waaraan ik telkens heel veel heb, die me heel veel energie geven. En Jaap en ik delen ook één belangrijke asset. Knippert u 2 keer met de ogen. We zitten heel graag en heel vaak samen en ik heb ook een gevoel, en dat is nog een derde reden om je te danken, Jaap. Ik trek me ook aan je op, net zoals ik mezelf kan optrekken, ook aan heel veel collega's. En zoals ik hoop dat heel velen van ons ook kunnen zeggen dat ze zich kunnen optrekken aan de unieke samenstelling, de unieke groep van collega's, collaboratoren, die we allemaal hebben hier bij ons. Dus dank voor je bijzonder creatieve vorm van presenteren, nogmaals voor dat schilderij, nogmaals voor het engageren van je petekinderen. Dank ook aan u allen. Ik weet dat uw aanwezigheid hier voor Jaap heel veel betekent, maar dit betekent ook heel veel voor ons. Want wij hebben natuurlijk graag publiektrekkers zoals Jaap. Dat u hier bent voor Jaap betekent ook dat u hier bent voor ons. Dus uw aanwezigheid, uw talrijke aanwezigheid is ook gewoon voor ons Heel fijn. Ik wil ook de corona zeer bedanken. Zelden zie je zoveel Sinterklaasen. Zie je zoveel mensen in een corona. En dat doet mij uiteraard als decaan, maar ook u denk ik veel goed. Wij zijn samen en wij betekenen voor Jaap veel. En Jaap betekent dus ook voor ons heel veel. En uiteraard, Jaap, ik dank je nu reeds voor zowel de inhoud van de gesprekken die we nog zullen voeren, voor de wijze waarop we die zullen voeren. En ik kan alleen maar zeggen, ik kijk daar bijzonder naar uit. En wij kijken daar met z'n allen naar uit. Nogmaals, Jaap, van harte gefeliciteerd. Proficiat. Huishoudelijke mededeling. Wij volgen Jaap zo meteen hier naar wat wij noemen het museum. Het is geen groot museum hoor, het is zeker niet tijdmodern. Waar u Jaap kan feliciteren. Ik denk dat een heleboel van de mensen in de zaal ook al weten waar ze meteen hierna naartoe moeten. Dat kan natuurlijk ook voor diegenen die niet kunnen wachten en Jaap al een handje willen geven of een zoen of een knuffel. Dat kan uiteraard ook hier zo meteen. Wij volgen de cortège en wij volgen onze net benoemde hoogleraar, professor Dr. Jaap.